Hello everyone, it's Trevor Horwitz here, and welcome to the InfraGard Atlanta What's Trending Payment Card Industry Security and Compliance Roundtable. My name again is Trevor Horwitz. I'm one of the board members of InfraGard Atlanta, and I'll be one of the presenters and also one of the panelists for this talk. I'd like to welcome everyone and thank you for joining us. So before we begin, just a couple of housekeeping matters, a little bit about InfraGard. InfraGard, as you may know, is a partnership between the FBI and the private industry. It's an association that includes business, academia, state and local law enforcement with the goal of preventing hostile attacks against the U.S. The opinions in this presentation are merely of the presenters themselves and not necessarily representative of InfraGard or InfraGard Atlanta Members Alliance. So with that said, let's get going and introduce our panelists. The first one I'd like to introduce is Mr. Rich Emrich. Rich, why don't you say a few words and introduce yourself?
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Rich Emrich, and I manage e-commerce, treasury, and bursar operations here at Northwestern University. Over the past few years, with relatively limited budget and lower levels of concern, we've been working on ways to get our campuses fairly compliant, understanding that most of our departments that we call merchants don't really think of themselves as such. They're really academic units, first and foremost. And so I'm very pleased to be participating in this discussion because it's been a long and ongoing journey toward some of these toward compliance and some of these challenges we'll talk about today.
Thank you, Rich. Our next panelist is Dr. Philip Halem-Baker. Philip, why don't you say hello to our audience?
Oh, yes. I've been in the payments and security world now for about 25 years after I got involved when I started working on the World Wide Web at CERN. And we started to look at security and e-commerce. And so Tim Berners-Lee asked me to take a look at that stuff and see what we could do to make the web secure. So I'm mostly known as a protocol architect and designer. I've had a hand in most of the security specs that have come out of IETF consortium over the past 20-odd years. And I wrote a book on internet crime, .crime Manifesto.
Thank you, Philip. So without further ado, let me again introduce myself, Trevor Horwitz. I'm the founder and CISO of TrustNet, a provider of IT security and compliance services. I'm also a qualified security assessor, so PCR falls squarely into my domain. Our company provides IT security and compliance services for mainly mid-sized and large enterprises worldwide. As you can hear from my accent, I was born in South Africa, so we have a variety of accents on the line today. I guess, Rich, you're probably the only real American in the group.
Sorry.
So let me just run through quickly the agenda. We've actually pre-selected 8 topics that we'd like to discuss in the webinar today. We start off talking about EMV and chip and pin technologies, then mobile payments. We'll discuss a little bit about the migration from SSL and early TLS into more secure data transmission protocols. We'll touch on point-to-point encryption, the PCI and the cloud, the new designated entities, which is a new validation requirement for certain entities, which the PCI has put together. We'll touch on two-factor authentication, and then talk a little bit about shadow IT and finding hidden cardholder data. And there'll be time at the end of the webinar also for questions. So I want to encourage the audience attendees to please send us your questions. Again, we'll answer them at the end of the webinar, time permitting. So without further ado, let's just talk a little bit about payment card security and why it's such a big issue. I know, folks, unless you've been in a cave for the last 5 years, IT security and payment card security has obviously been top of mind. But it's a huge problem here in the U.S. in particularly because we account for 47% of the world's credit card fraud, but yet only about 24% of the actual volume of payment cards. So it's a huge big thorn in the side for merchants, for service providers, the card brands themselves. And with that 47% of the total fraud that's been going on, talking about billions of dollars being lost in fraud every year. So that has a real impact on the U.S. and on our economy as well. So we're going to dive into our first topic, which is talking about EMV and chip and PIN technologies. As folks probably know, EMV has been rapidly adopted over the last 12 months. On October 1st was the deadline for EMV adoption, and now that has passed, which means that the so-called liability shift has happened. And the liability shift means that the party, either the issuer or the merchant, who does not support EMV, essentially assumes liability for all counterfeit card transactions in a cardholder present transaction. So my first question is really to Philip. What do you think is the biggest misconception about EMV and PCI compliance? Will EMV reduce payment card fraud?
Well, I think that it's certainly going to reduce card present fraud. There are two types of credit card transaction. One of them is a card present, one where you go into a store in person and hand over your card. And the other is the card not present, or MOTO, the mail order rules. Obviously, EMV isn't going to have much effect on the mail order fraud and may not have a huge effect on the overall volume of fraud, in that it is possible that card present fraud will simply shift to card not present fraud. However, what we're looking here is the start of a process, not the end. And what the banks are doing here is to lock down the part of the payment system where we've got a really good mature technology that is known to work. And so that's going to be the start of the process, but it isn't going to be the end.
Thank you. Rich, what do you think about when it comes to Northwestern? You're a large institution. You have many facilities, many different types of payment card transactions. How has EMV impacted your payment processing today?
I think the impact has been fairly low as I think about about the school in general. And I guess I forgot to sort of profile the school. We're a $2 billion institution. We have two campuses, two primary campuses here in Chicago. We have six different schools. Some 13,000 students and about as many faculty and staff. And sort of anecdotally, I like to say, because it's changing all the time, that we have approximately 200 cash handling locations or departments on both campuses, and they may handle cash and checks, but a good 100 of them also accept credit cards. So those are the ones, obviously, that we're worried about. And as we've been implementing EMV and PCI compliance in general in these locations, whether it be with a third-party service provider or with a standalone swipe terminal, the card present transaction impact of EMV, if you will, has been, I would say, negligible. An example I would use is we recently implemented, it's probably not a good idea to mention specific vendor names, but we implemented with a vendor who placed P2PE and EMV enabled card swipe devices on registers within our Kellogg School of Business here. And the process was done with the vendor over the phone. They were not actually on site, and our IT team. I mean, the whole thing was completed on 12 or so registers within about 2 hours. It was after hours, but there really was no impact to business, and yet I think I would think the majority of students here and faculty and staff at that time had not really had an EMV card present experience. So it's something that I think is quickly understandable and has had a very low impact here, at the point of sale.
So, Philip, the majority of countries are using the chip and PIN technology, but the U.S., Mexico, and Brazil have opted for chip and signature. Signatures to me seem so outdated and frankly seem to provide almost zero additional security. Most people just do a little scribble. Do you think this is flawed? Should we have followed the rest of the world in using the chip and PIN?
Okay, well, whenever you're looking at security, you're looking at the security of a system and not just one piece. And so if you look at what we use our cards for, most people have credit cards and most people have a debit card that is also their ATM card. So when they go up to an ATM, they're going to be pushing that card into the ATM. And if they have to remember a different PIN for their ATM use and their credit card use, well, obviously things aren't going to work. So there's a usability factor that means that you have to have one PIN. Now, consider what happens if you don't upgrade the ATM terminals so that they're using the chip rather than the card swipe. If they're using the chip instead of the card swipe and they're using the PIN, well, now you've got a ready way of getting any merchant who can skim the card has a new way of cashing out that card. They can cash them out at ATMs instead of using them for fraudulent card transactions. So looking at the security of the whole system, going to chip and signature is probably a better choice simply because the PIN probably isn't necessary for card payment security. The number of stolen cards that are then used is probably smaller than the problem that we would have with swipe card skimming continuing and then be used to cash out at ATMs if they use chip and PIN. So it does have a rationale.
Okay, interesting. When I first saw what was happening in the industry, it seemed to me that the main reason for using chip and signature versus chip and PIN was from a convenience factor. One of the issues that we see also with EMV is that it really hasn't exactly stood up to the bulletproof security that it was really intended to produce. We've seen several attacks. In fact, last week there was a really interesting article from a French research company on cardholder fraud. Essentially a man-in-the-middle attack using authenticated chip and some very sophisticated technology. And another recent attack we've seen is a sophisticated replay attack. There's a great article on Brian Krebs' blog which talks about that as well, if anyone's interested. So let's move on to the next topic and talk about mobile payments. The mobile payment industry is rapidly evolving. We've got Apple Pay, Android Pay, Square, PayPal, all have strong offerings. So, Rich, how do you see these mobile payment technologies impacting the cardholder industry in general, and Northwestern in particular?
Sorry, what was that last part?
Just talking about how the impact of mobile payments at Northwestern.
Right. So, I mean, we've all got smartphones, or most of us do anyway. But I remember about a year ago. I mean, it's almost cliche now that we see everyone walking down the street, and sometimes in their car, staring down at their phones, and we sort of jokingly refer to this generation of kids going through the university here as the sort of the handheld generation. So I think if you, I can't speak about the entire industry, but here in higher education, I think it's an absolutely vital component of credit card acceptance as we move forward. Because a lot of these devices, of course, interact with applications on the smartphone. Not all of them do, but putting that aside for a moment, it's vital for the university here, also because it plays an increasingly large role with this handheld generation attending very large fundraising events that are often outside. Alumni groups around the country are meeting and wanting to raise money for the university. And we get a steady stream of calls from these alumni groups or from our development management here at the university asking if it's okay that they use the Square or that they use such and such a device. So it's clear that and we've had to provide them. So it's clear that the demand is on the rise, and we've had to scramble at times to work with our outside consultants, our QSA, well, not you yet, Trevor, but we've consulted our other QSAs and a card processor on devices that they feel are allowable and ultimately condoned by our acquiring bank. So I think there is still a healthy amount of skepticism here, and we look to we look to our QSA and our card processor to give us guidance on what device to use. And then there are a whole host of sort of business process issues that we need to consider, particularly if it's a plug into a smartphone. Being able to track who's using it. The phone is may need to be university property and may need to be assigned to a particular location, so we can assign the revenue that comes in through that mobile device to that location. But we're very much in the process of figuring this out, and yet it's happening already, and we've got these devices in people's hands now, but just I would say in a relatively narrow way. But I do see it expanding. Yes.
So a question now back to Philip. The PCI Security Standards Council had released the PCI Mobile Payment Acceptance Security Guidelines, and this was targeted for developers. And that came out in 2012. And since then, there's really been no standards that have been released. Do you think the industry needs specific mobile security standards, or is the industry just changing too rapidly that creating a standard right now would be premature?
Well, at the moment, we've not really got open standards for mobile payments. In that we have, I can make a payment at Panera using my Apple Watch, or I can go to places and I can use my Android phone. But each of those systems that are out there is a single device ecosystem. You can have a terminal that can accept payments from multiple devices, obviously, but the merchant has to go off and establish independent relations with all the payment systems in addition to taking cards. There's a lot of complexity there. There's a lot of integration there. It's not like the credit card system where you have the four-corner model and everybody knows their places, and anybody who wants to set up in any one of those four corners has a very well-defined set of functions, etc., that they're meeting. So the reason that you would need standards from PCI would be you're going to have an agreement from Apple and Android that one set of security standards is going to meet both their needs. And I don't see the industry convergence getting to the point at this point where that's going to happen. Everybody has this idea that they're going to have the whole pie and everybody's going to buy their device and they're not going to need to talk to anybody. And it's probably going to take another 3-4 years before people realize that maybe that's not true.
Yeah, you make some really good points there. I think one of the issues we've seen from the consumer side is the failure fatigue. There have been so many mobile payment solutions that have failed. Philip, I think we're getting some feedback from your line whenever I'm speaking, so maybe you can mute that. Anyway, what I was saying is I think we're getting failure fatigue with consumers because so many of these mobile technology solutions have failed. Just talking about this SoftCard, which some of you may know as a joint venture between AT&T, T-Mobile, and Verizon, that shut down in March. The venture actually had the misfortune to be initially named the ISIS mobile wallet and then was rebranded SoftCard. But it caused an issue for consumers because the application was almost impossible to be uninstalled from these mobile wallets from their phones, even after the venture had already shut down. So I think failure fatigue is a big issue here and is going to sort of stem the adoption rate for a lot of consumers. So let's move on to our next slide and talk about data transmission, encryption, SSL. This, I guess, is an issue which is squarely within Philip's domain. As you know, the recent version of PCI version 3.1 has outlawed the use of SSL and early versions of TLS. Have you seen a big trend? Has the majority of the industry reacted fast enough to this change? Are there companies out there, are a lot of them still using SSL? That was for Philip. Philip, are you there? Philip, have you gone offline? All right, seems we've got a technical issue. Can't seem to hear one of our presenters. Rich, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm wondering if the reverberation we were getting and muting that had something to do with muting him in general.
Yeah, okay. Well, again, a technical issue. We'll have to come back to Philip on that. So let's move on to another issue, and I know this is something that, Rich, you're busy with at the moment, point-to-point encryption. This has been a big step up in security for a lot of companies implementing. Hello? You're back on. Philip, we'll move on to point-to-point encryption. We'll come back to the SSL question. So, Rich, what do you see? Do you see that the point-to-point encryption providing a lot of value to you as a user of payment card systems? I mean, how do you approach this from Northwestern's perspective?
Well, the short answer is a definitive yes. We are our approach. Excuse me, is to again we have a very disparate, decentralized environment here, one in which it's difficult, if not impossible, to mandate anything. So I just want to make that clear, and that's probably not uncommon among the large private universities in the United States. It's just an environment in which every school that's made a name for itself has a dean, and they have they just sometimes they and their organization can't be sort of told what to do. So it's difficult to navigate this, but But as far as P2PE goes, our approach is to implement a P2PE solution, just to cut right to the chase, wherever we possibly can. And I mean, the easy targets, I think, are the departments that are using a desktop standalone card swipe machine, or have brought unknowingly brought a PC into scope by using it to process a payment, or even a cash register that is taking card swipes. Our goal here is to as rapidly as possible, and over the next, say, 6 months, to convert as many of these to fully encrypted solutions, so to keep the card data safe, but more importantly, to reduce the burden, the SAQ and compliance burden for department staff, which is often bare bones. And so there's, we see nothing. Excuse me. We see nothing but an upside in implementing that as quickly as possible.
And Philip, what's your take on P2P? Do you foresee any security issues or flaws in the P2P approach?
Well, I don't see any flaws in the approach. I've not read the spec or reviewed it in detail personally. In general, though, I think that people need to be looking at point-to-point encryption for far more than just payments. If you look at the recent TalkTalk breach in the UK, the Ashley Madison breach, and so on, there's a whole range of attacks that we're seeing now where an attacker penetrates a system with the idea of they're going to hold user data hostage and demand a ransom for it. And that's a new hacker business model. And anybody who is storing data that could hurt them if it is disclosed needs to be thinking about encrypting it as soon as they get hold of it, and making sure that the decryption points are as limited as possible.
Okay, those are all good points. One of the big issues with P2P is the apparent lack of interoperability. With many merchant solutions, once you're selected a P2P solution, for the most part, you're stuck with that and stuck with the processor that supports that. I think at the moment, many of the processors are only offering one P2P solution. And so if you decide to change your processor, maybe you can get a better rate for service, or you have a customer service issue with that processor. That means replacing your terminals and other equipment. Rich, what's your take on that aspect of it?
I'm sorry. Could you just summarize the question one more time? I apologize.
I was just saying that once you select a P2P solution, it seems like
you're
stuck with just using that vendor's equipment.
Yeah, I don't think we're far enough along yet to be able to comment on that. Although I would say that our recent partnership with Card Connect and with your firm TrustNet, and also a local firm, Arrow Payments, we've received some assurances there that in leveraging Card Connect to be essentially our back-end SAQ portal provider, as well as our card processor and provider of a P2PE gateway, into which a lot of the P2PE devices can plug into. That we know First Data is behind Card Connect, and First Data is one of the largest card processors. I just don't. My gut feeling is that there isn't a lot of risk here in going down that path with our departments. The only concern that I would have is maybe one that I don't know if Philip touched on this or not, but I'm not familiar with the encryption protocol. I know it's an industry standard, sort of triple encryption protocol. There again, I mean, if the cyber criminal world is able to figure a way to hack that encryption, or I can think of some other scenarios, but then I think we're in a position of backpedaling or implementing the next thing that we think is foolproof. But again, what we like about this is that it really brings a particular operation out of scope with respect to PCI, or mostly out of scope, reduces the SAQ to something like 12 questions, and it reduces the overall burden on a very limited staff within a particular area around compliance.
Okay, thanks, Rich. So I want to go back to our earlier question for Philip, talking about secure data transmission. And this was we were talking about SSL being deprecated and early versions of TLS. Philip, have you seen a big swing? Is the majority of the industry now switched out SSL for more secure data transmission protocols?
Yes. In general, I think it's important to have a bit of context here and to recognize that the industry tends to be extremely conservative in our approach to encryption. And we're usually telling people to stop using crypto when we lose confidence in it, not when it has been broken. And so we told people to stop using MD5 back in the 90s, long before the system was definitively broken. We started telling people to move away from SHA-1 as soon as the SHA-2 specification was published. The thing is, though, that it does take an incredibly long time for the legacy software to go away, and in particular legacy browsers. So at this point, none of the current browsers support SSL as far as I know. If they do, it's in a compatibility mode that you have to turn on. TLS, we're starting to kill some of the earlier versions that aren't very secure. And later this year, the CAs are sunsetting. There are going to be no new certificates issued with SHA-1. And there's a drop-dead date for that in 2016. So if you're running a current browser, you're not going to be seeing SHA-1 certificates. But that doesn't mean that they're going to go away completely, in that there's a large, even if you've got a 1% tail of browsers that haven't been upgraded, well, 1% of the internet is still 10 million users. So that's a lot of users, and just turning off the crypto is not necessarily the best thing to do. The other problem that we're increasingly getting now is there are a lot of embedded devices that have SSL built in, and those devices tend not to have been kept up to date as assiduously as the browsers, and in some cases there's no way to update them. So there are deployment traps and upgrade traps.
And Philip, what's on the horizon in terms of new encryption technologies?
Well, at this point, as far as symmetric ciphers go, we're actually very confident with SHA-2, and we've got a replacement for that with SHA-3. We're confident in both of them, actually. For encryption, AES is good as far as we know, but it came out 15 years ago. We would like a replacement. So we've got a backup for that. The main action is actually in public key crypto, and there is a new push to deploy elliptic curve cryptography. However, that new push looks like it's going to take a completely different direction and throw out all the work that was done on the NIST curves. There are issues there are intellectual property issues there, and also there are some accusations that some of the parameters might possibly have been generated in peculiar ways that give crackers an advantage. And so what we're looking at now is going to a new set of electric curve cryptography. We're just getting the documents together for the encryption version of those and starting work on the signature version. And those are probably going to be coming out in browsers possibly as soon as next year. But that's still a work in progress.
Okay, so let's move on into our next topic, which is talking about PCI in the cloud. So, as you folks may know, that the cloud is having a huge impact on the IT industry in general. And there are some guidelines that actually came out back in February 2013. I happen to be on the special interest group for the PCI as the council special interest group, and talking about these things. So, Philip, what's your take in terms of cloud provisions and PCI? Are we heading in the right direction in terms of having the right security protocols in place, or are there big gaps there from a security perspective?
Well, with any of these systems, if you can put as many functions as possible into a place where there's going to be a dedicated staff that is considering securing just that one function, then you're probably going to get a better security result, because the costs of meeting compliance and providing security controls can be amortized over more installations. It's much easier to secure a small number of data centers running PCI in the cloud than every single merchant's payment system. That said, the problem is that you can't put everything in the cloud, because your point of sale terminal isn't going to be in the cloud, and your shopping cart, well, the shopping cart for online payments may also be in the cloud, but it's probably going to have to be in a different cloud. And so then you've got a question of how do you connect up one set of systems to another, and then that gives you a series of issues that you've got to be concerned with. In general, we don't see cryptographic systems being breached. What we see is the gaps between the cryptographic systems and the real world being attacked, because that's usually the point at which the problems arise.
That's excellent. You make a great point there. Rich, what about from your perspective at Northwestern? How's the cloud impacting your business relative to PCI? Do you have cloud implementations right now, or you small implementations?
Don't. No, I think we're still in the we're still assessing risks. I think we're yet to really kind of have any kind of material presence in the cloud at this point. There might be a couple of exceptions that I'm not aware of that are outside the realm of payment acceptance, but in the payment system, no, we're really not there.
So, do you see it being a concern as far as liability? To date, we haven't had any sort of major cloud provider have a serious breach. But do you feel like if that happens, that there's some sort of shared responsibility, and who bears responsibility in those cases? Rich, your take on it?
Yeah, that's a tough one for me to answer. I think I guess responsibility to some degree is. I realize this is going to be a little bit of a lame answer, but ultimately the responsibility, in my mind, is dictated by the card brand master agreements and is dictated by the contractual agreement between the university and whoever whoever the provider is that's operating in the cloud, I suppose. And so I don't. I'm intrigued by what Philip said a moment ago about cryptography, and I've been tracking a little bit. In fact, I'm on one of the groups that I'm on the program committee for is the Treasury Symposium, which is a group of larger U.S. universities that come together in conference every January. This coming January, the theme is risk, and there's been a lot of discussion about the concept, not through experience, but just through picking it up actually on the television, actually. But this concept of quantum cryptography, and the idea that it's rooted in the fundamentals of physics, the laws of physics, and fundamentally unhackable in that regard. I mean, if that's in some sense what we're talking about in the cloud, then I feel like I feel much better about it, because I don't see, unless the sender or the recipient of the data, whatever that data is not who they are presenting themselves to be, then in my mind it's a foolproof system. So I think if we're talking about sophisticated cryptography in the cloud, I'm feeling a lot better about it. But I don't, since we're not there, I don't have a whole lot to say about it. Sorry.
Okay. Well, thanks for that. So one of the next topics is to talk about designated entities. So this designated entity is a new validation criteria that the PCI Security Standards Council has introduced, and this so-called supplemental validation, it doesn't really require any new PCI requirements. Instead, it tells an entity how they need to meet PCI requirements that are already included within the data security standard. So the applicability for this really comes down to the acquirer or the payment brands, and they will determine whether an entity should comply. So it appears the intent of this is really to look at some high-risk entities, those that have either previously been breached or perhaps those that are too big to fail. And the idea behind this is to have a process that ensures that the security controls within the payment, within PCI DSS, are continually enforced, the so-called business as usual concept. So a couple of things just to point out for our audience members, what are those things? They talk about in the standard monitoring security controls for effectiveness, detecting and responding to failures promptly, reviewing changes in the cardholder data environment, compliance impact and PCI scope changes that need to be reviewed, communication with personnel, and then reviewing technology on an annual basis for vendor support and security effectiveness. So it seems like when you look at these things that all the large recent data leaks have occurred at companies that have at one point been assessed as being compliant. If you look anecdotally, technically none of them were compliant at the time of the breach. So this question goes out to Philip. Do you think that the lack of consistent enforcement is at the root of some of these data breaches?
Well, I'm not so sure that it's a lack of enforcement, because in a lot of cases, the technologies required to secure the data that was being collected simply didn't exist. And the only practical way to have avoided a breach was to have not collected the data at all, or to have collected it in a way that allowed it to be encrypted at the point of capture and only decrypted somewhere safe in the infrastructure. I think as a general rule, though, one thing that I think is important here is that we've shifted away from looking at the problem in terms of merchants and payment systems aggregators and so on, and in terms of the function. And now we're looking at how attractive are these targets to an attacker? What is the monetary value of going after them? And that's probably the right way of looking at it, because that's going to tell us which attacks are worth doing and which ones aren't. The smaller, a mom and pop shop is also doing credit card processing. Probably doesn't have any security controls at all, but isn't very interesting to an attacker, even if it's really easy to attack, because they're not going to get enough card numbers to be worthwhile taking. If you can crack Target, if you can attack Ashley Madison, if you can attack TalkTalk, you can get a lot of card numbers in one place. And that's the significant piece. And looking at the problem in that terms, I think, is a big improvement on what we were doing before.
Okay, thank you for that. So moving on to our next topic on two-factor authentication. So as many of our audience know, PCI requirement 8.3 specifies that the merchant must use two-factor authentication for providing remote access to the network. So, Philip, can you just give a quick overview for our audience about what is two-factor authentication?
Okay, so we're all familiar with passwords, and a password is something that I know. That's something known is what we call a factor. So another way that we can authenticate somebody is by something that they carry. So when they have a credit card, the credit card is something that they carry. So that's something that so that's a second factor. So if you have chip and pin, that's a two-factor system because it's something that's known, the pin, and it is something that is carried, the card. And then another factor that is sometimes used is a biometric. So if you have your iPhone and the fingerprint scanner, well, that is checking to make sure, that's looking for something that you are. So two-factor authentication, in most cases for payments, we're talking about something you know and something you have. And the combination is very strong because an attacker can easily find out a password, and it's quite easy for them to obtain a device. But getting a device and a password that corresponds to that device is a much harder problem for them to, if they're 1% successful at both of them, well, they're only going to be 0.01% successful at the pair, and that's what they need to actually make money from the crime.
And Rich, this question goes out to you. You know, a college campus is a great place to test out technologies because essentially you have a closed group. If a university, and this is not necessarily Northwestern, but if a university had mandated two-factor authentication for all students and faculty who wanted access to the university's network, what do you think the reaction would be? Would there be like mass chaos? Would zombie apocalypse? How would you see students and faculty reacting?
Well, I think the short answer is it depends. I mean, one of our key strategic priorities is customer service, and that translates into making the life of the typical department administrator, certainly the life of a faculty member, and most certainly the life of our students to be as easy and burden-free as possible. But customer service also means making sure everyone is safe, and that creates the rock and the hard place for us here. I certainly understand the concept of two-factor authentication, and Lord knows we follow it day in and day out in most of the things that we do here with our banking systems and treasury and so forth. And I think it's effective. I think that like any other change, and we're very much still an organization that doesn't like change. I mean the guts of the organization. The leadership is pushing change now. We have a new regime, and they're pushing change, focusing on customer priority. customer service, excuse me. But as with any change, I think if there is good communication and there's good marketing and explanation for why this is important, and to your question, if it could be tested and the test results were good, then I think it's okay. But we need to consider, what networks are we talking about? I mean, are we all too often the phones start ringing because a student is missing a $25 payment that's easy to make on our online student system, and because of that, they're not able to get a transcript, or they're not able to enroll in the next class, or what have you. Now we ask them to pat their pockets and find that secure token, and they don't have that, and so how can we help them? We can send them back to their dorm room to look around for it, or I mean, these are some of the issues we'd have to consider. But to be sure, like any large private school or any large research university that's trying to attract that's trying to attract the best faculty. Certainly in the research realm, and going to great financial lengths to bring them here. The last thing in the world that this faculty member is going to want to have to deal with is a secure token or a second authentication mechanism to access the network. So it's complicated. I mean, there's not an easy answer. We would have to approach it with a great deal of through testing, of course, but then a great deal of change management involvement. We have a large group here that does that. So it would not be an easy thing, but it would not be impossible.
Great, thanks, Rich. So moving on to our next, and this is really our final topic for today, before we do the Q&A. One of the issues that constantly crops up for us as a QSA and doing assessments is looking at hidden cardholder data. And this sort of dovetails into the shadow IT. And for those who are not familiar, shadow IT is a term that's used to describe IT systems and solutions that are built outside the IT organization, often without explicit approval for the IT department. Those will include things like using Dropbox, Google Docs, separate Gmail systems, Skype, not to get political here, but private email servers used to store secure and classified information. So when it comes in that context, Rich, what do you think, how do you control this from a payments perspective and from your perspective at Northwestern? How do you go about controlling shadow IT?
Yeah, I think oh boy, that's a tough one. I think when you and I were talking the other day, actually, Trevor, and about various marketing campaign tools, posters up everywhere, frequent email pushes out to the broad community, screensavers that warn about what not to click on, and only click on, or only open emails from people that you recognize, and so forth, and oh, by the way, don't even think about entering into a relationship with a developer in the absence of a legal contract in which payments will be accepted, and no one else no one else is involved. I mean, we do have here at the university we have a great deal of internet content. We have a web page that walks that if people are aware of it, and we do go to great lengths to make it known that for folks that want to accept credit cards, the application process and the staff training and the attestations that need to happen and the timeline and all of the steps are really clearly laid out, as well as the cost of doing business, which is not always clear to people at the forefront. They're thinking, of course, of collecting revenue, but they're not thinking at all about, say, the interchange rate or the cost of compliance or the, so forth. So we try to make that very clear to them. So I don't. I mean, ultimately, in a corporate environment, which certainly most of my career has been in. I mean, obviously, someone, I suppose, depending on the particular corporate environment. But I would say overall, if someone were to engage in something like that, they could be fired. In a private university or maybe even in a private company, that often doesn't happen. So that that thread is not there. That thread of the impetus to follow published process, procedure, compliance rules, policies. There's the word I'm looking for. Policies. I mean, I think it's again in a decentralized private organization with multiple physical locations. It's difficult to control that. So I think an awareness campaign goes a long way. We are internally they steer us away from any kind of fear-based tactics, even though I think there's a context for that because there's a reason why we have this policy. There's a reason why we're asking you not to have a shadow IT relationship or application or God forbid organization, and that is that the cost of a data breach and all the costs that will follow a data breach are significant. But we tend to take a sort of a risk-based approach to our communication, and I think it's fairly successful. But as you know, we continue. I don't know, once a month, every other month, to find something that that is. I mean, it's some kind of rogue operation that is either without a contract or is nobody else was involved in entering into this relationship with the vendor, or it's just simply a custom application that is actually being used in an academic setting by students, and that's the ultimate rock and a hard place for us, because we need to get them to understand, and at the same time everyone else around them to understand why this is a risk to the university. But at the same time, if we shut it down and disrupt the learning process for students, then that gets escalated very quickly. And so there's really it's difficult to come out with a win in that kind of a situation. But we do the best we can, and I think by staying close to our QSAs and consultants like you, Trevor, I think we'll get there.
Thanks, Rich. So it looks like we've got like a minute left, and I'm going to leave the final QA question, and let's see if we can get Philip's take on this. One of our audience has asked, what are your thoughts about the future and current status of tokenization? Where do we stand on that? Is it a good idea, bad idea?
What do you mean by tokenization? Do you mean giving people secure ID type tokens for two-factor or something else?
I think the court has indicated this is related to PCI, so tokenizing payment card data information.
Oh, so anonymizing it or whatever.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah, well, that's another approach to cryptography. To anything that means that your data flowing over the net is not something that an attacker can cash out on. Yeah, that's good.
Okay. So it seems like we're about out of time here for any more questions, and I just want to firstly thank Philip and Rich for being on the webinar on behalf of Atlanta InfraGard, and we appreciate everyone who attended the webinar, and obviously our panelists. If anyone's interested in joining InfraGard, please go to the infragard.org website. And if you need more information about upcoming events such as this, our President Jeff Gaynor and Director of Outreach Lawrence Tobin, their emails are up on the screen. So I want to thank everyone for their attendance today, and again, thank you to our attendees. And we'll see you on the next webinar coming up. I think our next one is coming up in December, so look out for more information on that. Thanks, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day. Hello.